going to say very brief opening remarks to contextualize for you why we invited you to speak as part of this comparative project, Rising Waters, Philadelphia and Mumbai. And before we do that, we just want to say thank you to a bunch of people who made this happen.
Yeah, thanks so much to all of you for coming and enabling all of you to come. A big thanks to Paul Farber, who, as managing director, has been in touch with most all of you to bring you here, bring the food here, bring this room here. Paul, thank you so much. Thanks to the folks at Perry World House who have allowed us to use this space. And thanks also to the folks in the Department of Anthropology and German for supporting this workshop. Bethany will begin by saying a little bit about how we got here, both here in the workshop, but also here in the project.
Yeah. So how did we get here is the annual topic of the program in environmental humanities being directed by Professor Etienne Benson, sitting at that far end of the table, far in distance but not in mental energy. And we wanted to talk not so much about the program in environmental humanities topic this year, but actually how did Nikhil and I get here? How did we start working together? How did that happen? The short answer is we applied for a grant together. We applied for a Making a Difference grant, which is an initiative of the School of Arts and Sciences here at Penn. And we would also like to thank our Dean, Steve Fluharty, for funding us. That was really pretty exciting to us. We're going to tell you about the structure of the grant itself a little bit. And we're also going to tell you, we're going to invite you over the course of the day to think with us about this emergent comparative framework that we're actively thinking through. Over the course of the last week, Nikhil and I have given 2 talks already about this emergent comparative framework, and we're going to try to keep it fresh. But we are joking that we're making concert tour t-shirts. So if you'd like to book us, we're happy to come and do our 2-step routine that we have now. We're working on. Our 2-step routine, though, actually started well before, obviously, we applied. Well before we applied for this grant, and it started, as all good things do here in Philadelphia, in the waters of the Schuylkill River. Here you see a really awkwardly shot slow-mo of Nikhil. I filmed this when we went out kayaking together to really think about these various confluences that we were both interested in. And we like this still because I think it helps animate some of the larger concerns of this project, which is not only that Nikhil is doing that slow work of really attending to this really ugly, sad, old refinery under a bridge, which hopefully is safe, but you never know in this country with infrastructure. And you also see I'm shooting it, and it's really hard. I'm in a kayak also, and of course Nikhil is moving faster than I am, and I'm trying to paddle and frame. We're thinking about what are the grounds for comparison when we have no stable ground beneath us, and we think that's really quite metaphorical for this project as a whole. Much of the assumptions of history, modernity are actually being rethought as we are writing. We wanted to think about what would be a comparative framework between here in Philadelphia and the work that Nikhil is doing on infrastructure, on urban waters, always in the plural, in Mumbai.
So comparison, right? Comparison is something that I have learned to generatively think with in the doing of projects, but comparison has always been central to any of our scholarship, almost regardless of discipline. When I finished my first book on municipal water supplies, I was getting interested in the ways in which Mumbai's water infrastructure is not just a story of Mumbai or cities in the south, but more broadly, and getting some kind of pushback in the United States, trying to render comparative projects across water infrastructures in these 2 places. But then, Flint happened and Detroit happened, and we began to see processes of comparison being made, not only, and actually even before these two, when Katrina happened, of like other worlds that are already present here in the US, of third worlds present here in the US. So we began to think a little bit more broadly about what it might mean to not just compare cities in the south or cities in the north, but cities across north and south. And here this is part of a blossoming conversation in geography right now. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Manli Ranganathan and Jenny Robinson, and Ananya Roy have written on this topic. And it's something that we would want to think about in this project too. What does it mean to compare like and unlike geographies together? Now there's a series of different historic operations that I think Dilip and Anu have worked a lot on comparatively across the US and India in particular, that make these distant cities and these distant geographies comparable, right? And that these comparisons are becoming all too clear when we see maps like this of like ways in which unchecked carbon cuts might come to reclaim large parts of the city that were once at one point a southern wetland, right? So projects of making projects of climate change are actually making the cities look a lot like the cities they were before the line between wet and dry was made and hardened. And so we're really delighted that Dilip and Anu can be here. I first encountered this work of theirs in Mumbai in 2008, 2009, when they were showing how the city was accreted through solidifying practices that included reclamation, but also map making and imagining in Mumbai over the 300-year history of the city. This is sort of like goes from the colonial state all the way into, from the East India Company actually, all the way into the post-colonial state and projects of solidification. This is also something that we see in Philadelphia, where you see like ways in which wetlands and creeks have sort of been filled in over the duration of the history of the city to make the city solid. You see in the southwestern parts of the city over there, the ways in which what was a wetland was subsequently settled through generations of housing policy in the city and in of the country, federal home ownership programs and the like, to make what was a marshy wetland dry for marginal residents, right? And when the cloudburst came, the flood warning flashed on my phone yesterday, this was the area I was most concerned about, because these are the areas that continue to flood first today.
These areas that Nikhil was just talking about, I'm sure many of you, if you came to the airport, you zoomed past them really quickly. Part of our project is to really slow down and really look at them with sustained and embodied attention. That's part of that uncomfortable kayaking experience as well. These southwestern marshlands today there are only 200 acres of wetlands left, and those are the site of the first urban national wildlife refuge in the United States, the John Hines Refuge, and they are active community partners with our project. This vast acreage was among the last to be developed. You can see here on the 1682 map some of the so-called salt farms that were made by using traditional Dutch and Northern European techniques of draining the salt marshes of this area. Some of the names you can see on this map are Swedish translators who translated between William Penn in 1682 when he was negotiating land deals with the Lenape in the area. This was a fertile and famed hunting ground, and actually was advertised quite widely throughout Europe to attract European settler colonists to the area, as you can see, quite successfully. Already by 1800, Philadelphia was the most populous city in the Americas. This marsh, as it was known, remained quite rural until the middle of the 19th century. Multiple energy regimes have come and gone in this area. The hydropower of the water itself used first during the colonial period to transport wood, energy regimes beget energy regimes, coal. As you may know, Schuylkill County is the place where hard coal, so-called hard coal or bituminous coal, was discovered. The river became, by the early 19th century, known for its famed Schuylkill punch, very high, lot of coal in the river and coal dust. And then in the 1860s, this refinery was sited here, right in at the confluence of the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers. It's an incredibly important flyway stop on the Atlantic migratory route, and hence the decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service to try their first urban refuge, to try to think, I think, sort of avant la lettre, about entanglements and multi-species places. This particular etching was made by a student of Thomas Eakins. This is Joseph Pennell, trained here in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And I really love this. This is from a series of engravings that Pennell made, all of which evoke both the rich plant life still at this time. If you have ever been out on the Schuylkill today, well, you saw Nikhil out on the Schuylkill, you can see it doesn't look much like this. So we started asking ourselves on that kayaking trip, how could we even apprehend this landscape that had changed so dramatically? What would be the origin of this story? When would we start the story of this? What kinds of knowledge communities would we need? Who did we need to collaborate with? Not only how would we think about its pasts and presents, but how might we imagine other futures for it? And this particular book became quite helpful for us, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, this is a book that was published in 1984-85. I'm not sure which of the two days. 84, I think, by Thompson, Warburton, and Hatley. They tried to apprehend the problem that was soil erosion in the Himalayas. And they discovered, they're soil scientists, and as they were working, they discovered that what the problem of erosion in the Himalayas was depended in large part as to who was studying it, right? Agriculture, soil scientists saw the problem of erosion in one way. People that were studying questions of social, inequality, sociologists, were seeing the problem of erosion in a different way. And these actually were not necessarily either wrong, nor were they entirely consistent, right? So the question is, how do we study problems across the social sciences and the sciences and the humanities in a way that's generative and not necessarily necessarily has to be a battle? And what we actually discovered was a lot of the problem with these interdisciplinary projects were the ways in which they were defining problems was not sufficiently flexible or open-ended to allow for different problem definitions to coexist in the same project, right? So they should fall from the problem containing uncertainty, the uncertainty that contains the problem. This became important to us. Like, if we think about rising waters as a problem, what is the relationship between uncertainty and rising waters, right? Do uncertainties contain rising waters, or does rising water contain uncertainty? And the way in which we decide to respond to that question is actually will lead to a very different set of outcomes in collaboration and in knowledge generation. What was really nice about Thompson, Warburton, and Hatley, them being ahead of their time, was that they saw that the question of imagining problems need not be left to scientists or even social scientists alone, but also to artists. That it was scientists and social scientists who think incrementally about what is already there, but it is actually you could actually think about the world as being imagined, and questions of aesthetics and art and imagination are the site of like creating new imaginaries. I think is something that we were also propelled by in conceiving of this interdisciplinary project across humanities, social sciences, and sciences.
So that's when we put together the grant application, and we promised that we would teach 2 classes. We would build on the work of the nascent Schuylkill Corps, which we had founded shortly before going kayaking together, And we're going to just tell you a little bit briefly about the courses that we're teaching, and then we'll talk about that collaborative, public-facing core of Schuylkill advocates.
So Rising Waters is is focused on development of collaborative undergraduate research projects with students here at Penn and students at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. We're learning together across North and South. And at Penn, the way we propose to do this is by teaching 2 courses, this being the first one. Some of the students are here today. You can raise your hands. And so they're taking this class now where we think about many of the questions that we've been talking about thus far in the presentation, together with field research, right, or field-based, or field trips, right? So students in the class have gone to the water department, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants. We spent a day in Eastwick, the neighborhood we were talking about earlier, thinking about questions of racial and environmental injustice that have been produced through an intersection of urban development projects and histories of race and racialization in the city. Students will then apply for go through an application process and be selected as Rising Waters Fellows, and will subsequently take the class next semester that Bethany will talk about.
So this class, Liquid Histories and Floating Archives, I will teach in the fall. At the same time, Nikhil will be teaching in Mumbai, and students in both locations will be able to already start thinking about their ongoing research projects together. Here in Philadelphia, the students will be paired with historic archives here in the city. One at Bartram's Garden. Here you see a picture of an art installation which sank last summer, and you see the divers floating it here again. We can talk about that another time. Highly traumatic event. They'll be working with the historic archives at Bartram's and also at the Independent Seaport Museum. Although we are the Schuylkill core, we work on we're beginning to work more on the Delaware as well. One of the questions that students will be thinking about is, as the present is changing so rapidly, of course, it's recasting the way that we're thinking about the past. And the premise is that different things are floating to the surface. And students will be really thinking from the current perspective of rapid anthropogenically caused climate change, what is it in the past that is attracting their attention? And they'll have the chance to really work with archivists to curate a project which we will install here at Penn. We will have a boat that students will install dry bags with their projects inside them right before we leave for Mumbai. So I think that's a good beginning. We've promised that we would tell you a little bit more about this Schuylkill core. It's something that we've spent a lot of time developing. It's made up, you can see these 5 wheel spokes, also of a river research seminar, and I wanted to briefly say a word about that. Nikhil mentioned these various types of uncertainty that we're trying to also think together with scientists, with artists, with humanists, historians, archivists, etc. This summer, together with my co-convener of the Schuylkill Core, who's a Drexel professor, Peter DiCarlo, Pete's in Nepal right now measuring air quality, riding up and down a mountain, but sends his greetings. He and I are the co-conveners of the research seminar, and we'll co-teach together with 3 colleagues, 2 from the Academy of Natural Sciences and 1 from Penn Fine Arts, this intensive research seminar. We've been able to get the provost to sponsor 6 students who will take this 2-week on-water intensive. We'll be meeting in floating classrooms for 10 days. At the end of June, we have 4 community river fellows who will be announced next week. And we have 8 Drexel graduate students who will also be taking this class. Their projects are they will design projects which are meant to support our partners in the Schuylkill Core, which include the On-Water Consortium, a consortium of 6 nonprofits who educate Philadelphia adolescents both in boat making, historical boat making, and then when the children are then on the water, we're developing environmental humanities on water curriculum for them. So stay tuned. And we also are creating an archive, a living archive of the work we're doing here in Philadelphia, and we'll do the same for Mumbai as well, in partnership with the Penn libraries, who've been very helpful. You can see, this isn't live unfortunately, but I'm very pleased to say that all of the files from the fall semester River Research Seminar presentations are now up and available there. Our Ecotopian artists are there. A new round of toolmakers, Ecotopian toolmakers will be announced also next week. Stay tuned, we had an amazing crop. It's a record, an archive which we hope people will pluck from and develop the types of engagement materials that they find necessary. I think with that, and with an invitation to explore this growing archive, we'll officially open the symposium, and again say welcome and thank you so much for being here.
So I want to begin by saying that Anu is here. Anu and I basically have always seen the possibility that people do not just see things differently, but they see different things. Now, what does this mean for design? We are designers. What do we mean? What does it mean for design? What does it mean actually for inquiry, for academic inquiry? We ask the question, where does inquiry begin? When you raise actually this very fundamental possibility actually that people see different things. And where does design then begin? Now, one thing we know is that in India, basically life begins with a monsoon, a wind that brings profuse wetness to a place, to the entire tropics, tropical belt. It's sticking for some reason. It's not moving very smoothly, so I don't know. I'm just going to let it play, and I will just, if you can. It's a little sad, but let me try again. It's sticking. Just parts of it. Okay, this wetness begins not one, but two worlds. In the first, the moisture of the clouds envelop habitation. So you get a chance to see here. These are by and large the Western Ghats of India, on the west coast of India. So this is a world actually that is enveloped with wetness, and wetness that is everywhere to some degree. There's basically no dryness. I mean, even if I go to the deserts in India, I mean, I could do that, and I get a little bit of wetness. It holds in everything, spreading, soaking, blowing, seeping, osmoting, and transpiring its way to ever-extended holdings of wetness. In other words, wetness does not flow, it holds. It holds basically in holdings that eventually become the ocean that reconnects with the monsoon wind. The ocean from which the monsoon comes and goes, though, is not the Indian Ocean beyond the edge of a continent. It is rather an all-encompassing wetness called Sindhu. a Sanskrit word generally translated as ocean, but which can be translated more specifically as ocean of rain, Indu being a raindrop. This raindrop generates holdings that can be profoundly transformative, holdings that are alive, their biomass increasing exponentially for a period before receding. I mean, if you grow up actually in these parts, I mean, one of the things that we used to enjoy the moment the monsoon came, the kind of life that just emerged from the soil. I mean, frogs that, bullfrogs that just came out of, out of a lesser wetness to hold this greater wetness. To those unfamiliar with the monsoon, this transformation can be disorienting, a bewildering complexity. I mean, and that is a term that is generally used for the jungle. But to people who inhabit it, it is their everyday being. So as I said, there's no such thing as dryness. There's only wetness in varying degrees. But this is not the world that we're familiar with. This is not the world that we're educated into. We're educated into a world of dryness, where the rains from monsoon clouds fall to a surface of a subcontinent called India, gather in flows of water that run to lower ground and eventually back to the sea to begin the cycle again. So it's water here. It's not wetness, it's water. Divided between a land, which is why we are having workshops like this. We live in a deep fear of water that we see not just rising, but we also see coming. Now we ask a simple question. Whatever happened to Sindhu? What happened to the ocean of rain, where the language of habitation is wetness and not water? Wetness that holds in everything, not water that flows in some particular place. Wetness that is lived in rather than water that is in the service of land. We suggest, and basically we answer this question basically by saying this, that we live by design in two acts. The second act is familiar, that you see over here. It involves keeping water in its place, bringing intelligence to infrastructure, shaping urbanization, making development sustainable and resilient. Like I said, that's the second act. The first act is yet to be seriously interrogated. Who created land and water from wetness? This is an act that we all take for granted, or we attribute to a god. I mean, if you read the book of Genesis, it is a designer's manual, but it is also, to some extent, a surveyor's manual. So, I won't go into the book of Genesis, but you will see it playing out actually in what designers do. Now, so what does it take basically to create land and water? What I suggest is that it takes a time and it requires a line. So to talk about time, I take the hydrological cycle to begin with. I mean, it's a very complex cycle that you can see over here. I mean, this is one of the first drawings in the 1930s. And you can see the number of moments actually that water passes through and the phases actually, or the states of water in going through vapor, liquid form, etc., etc. But I'm going to just focus on this one, which is Paul Klee's drawing, Paul Klee being the artist at the Bauhaus in the 1930s and 40s. Rather simple, but this is how every child learned it. This, I presume, is how you all learned it in school. So it's precipitation in number one, flow formation, evaporation, and cloud formation. That's the way water, we are told, moves. Now, if you just think about it for a moment, this moment is the one in which we have anchored our reality. This is a moment actually in which maps are drawn, properties are marked, infrastructure is designed, past is described, present is experienced, and the future is envisioned. Which means to say that all the other moments are ephemeral. They become visitors. So therefore the monsoon comes and goes, and it's increasingly now becoming an unwanted visitor. You hope that it either finds the reservoirs or doesn't come at all, but you realize that you need it for your water. So you bear with it. But it's that kind of a world actually that is created by this particular understanding of time. We anchor in this particular moment. In this particular moment, we can draw maps. We can actually see a line between land and water precisely because we have separated what is above from what is below. Now think of God on the second day. This is what he did in order to create the firmament. Then what you do is, on the third day, you basically create land and water. You draw a line actually that separates this. Now you cannot do it in rain, which is why surveyors don't go out when it's raining, which is why the British actually referred to the monsoon as the foul weather season. And so maps and basically our whole living is constructed in a fair weather moment. So in that moment, we can create this, basically water somewhere and land on which we can settle, dry land. So we have a dryness and we have a wetness now, which we never did before. We only had wetness and we had degrees of wetness, but now we have dry and wet. And even if you don't have dry land, you have drainable land. And so we learn this in design, actually. We learn this in design of infrastructure. Now, actually, to go to the second requirement, and that is a line. Now, we all presume, actually, that we can draw lines. There are lines of all kinds, actually, lines that form shapes and sizes, and lines that are used for hashes, lines that are used for contours, lines that are used for letterings, lines that are used in triangulation. But I'm talking about a particular line, a well-endowed line, actually, that separates land from water. It has a remarkable ability of separating water from land. I mean, can anybody do that? Separate water from land, but a line, actually, that you draw can actually make the separation. So you have the sea and you have land, but then you also have this line that then calibrates a flow, can be erased to accommodate flood, contains in order to get a channel, begins in order to have a source, and separates, of course. So we just play this out, actually. There are three essentials of a river that we just take for granted, and we heard spoken about already today. It's there. We assume it is there, but it is there because of a line, and it flows because of a line. So you have a course, actually, that is contained between two lines, and if you just think about what Heraclitus, sort of asked us to do, and told us what we cannot do. He said, you cannot step into the same river twice, and of course then one of his students said, you can't step into it even once. But that's not the point. The point is actually not whether, there's change or no change. The question is that no one has drawn attention to the line that he asked us to cross, actually, to get into the water. So if you just think about where that line came from, we presume it is there. The second point actually is the source. It is the start of a line. Just think about it like this. How do you draw a line? I have to begin somewhere, which is why actually they're still searching for the source of the Nile. They're still searching for the source of the Ganges. In 2006, you had an expedition actually that went up the Nile and confirmed a source, a new source. And if you just think back, how many claims to sources have there been in this childish preoccupation searching for the point at the end of a line? When you know that rain falls all over and that rivers begin everywhere, and yet we think it begins at a point. And that is paradise. There's a whole theory there that goes with it. But then if you go to the third one, actually, a flood. Flood is nothing but the erasure of a line. I'm sure that when you drew, you used an eraser, and you can draw it again, and you can draw it again, and you can draw it again. And that's why we actually, have a line to accommodate flow. So these are the essentials, actually, and they really contribute to a visual literacy. You cannot presume that everybody has it. It is a cultivated literacy. So what we ask is that if this literacy and if this visualization is possible in this particular moment of time, what is the visualization possible in another moment of time? I want to suggest actually that this other moment of time is a very different nature. It has to have a different vocabulary. It cannot have a vocabulary of land and water. It has to have a vocabulary of gradients of wetness. It presumes an immanence. It cannot presume a transcendence. So you cannot get a geographic surface that you look down upon. So you get a completely different world. But if you think of a whole nature that has been constructed in support of that, you have to ask seriously, actually, who has been marginalized by this? You've got to ask, actually, if India is a colonized ground, actually, where land has been separated from water at some particular point in time, and And if there is another possibility and another nature at work behind the scene over here, and if that nature is Sindhu, which is the ocean of rain that still operates, and this is why India is in such deep trouble with this dissonance, actually, that doesn't make sense to anybody. People living two kinds of lives, one in order, one a disorder of a sort. So, where did this begin? Where did this come from? We believe, basically, that the people of India have been colonized, and colonized long before the current European, the recent erstwhile European colonization. Their colonization began with the academics of the school of Miletus, led by Thales, the first natural philosopher or scientist, as he was acknowledged by Aristotle. Now, this school invented the world map, and this is actually a reconstruction of the map of Hecataeus, and before that, it was Anaximander's map. A representation that basically deploys a line to separate land from water. They basically invented the first problem, the first scientific problem. Why does the Nile flood? Now you draw a line and the water crosses it and you yell flood, flood, flood. And so that's how the Nile floods. And so you then ask the people over there, why does the Nile flood? And everybody looks at you blankly. And then you think that they're plain stupid. So if you read Herodotus, actually considers these people ignorant. It's the first indications of underdevelopment, actually, in the world today. He never thought, actually, for a moment, that the Egyptians were looking back at him and saying, we don't see a river, and therefore we don't see flood. What we see, actually, is water rising and falling. If you think back, Thales also had a clue to this, that he believed that the earth was on water. But that sense of water rising and falling in Egypt also lays the ground for the possibility of a very different way of looking at settlement. That if you think that I'm living between two deserts in gradients of wetness, and water rises and which wetness rises and falls rather than flows from a source to the sea, which is another thing, by the way. They did not know the source of the Nile, which made them even more stupid. So if you just think about what this allows, you see actually that you have mounds over here, which allows for water to rise and fall, and mounds were famous in Egypt, and here you have another paradigm that sets in, which is a river between two lines, and the lines become levees. Think Mississippi, and you will actually understand this. But think of every so-called river in the world actually has been made into this kind of a condition, obviously, because it's the line drawn. So if there is a flood anywhere in the world, it's not because it's badly managed. It's just because we have drawn a line to try and hold wetness to a place, and wetness doesn't like to be held in a place. But this image actually was taken by Alexander across from, comes from Egypt after domesticating it, as it were. He travels to India. So the Nile basically would become the quintessential river. From being actually the first wetness to be colonized, it becomes a quintessential river. Its example will be carried to the east by Alexander the Great, a scholar who conquered not by winning battles in the battlefield, but by configuring the earth's surface, subjecting it to empirical investigation. And there's a reason why empirical has the same roots as empire. Actually, it was basically the oikumene, which is the inhabited earth, that he was subjecting actually to a kind of knowing, and that has become actually our science of today. So he came east, basically along this line, and you must remember that what he faced there was the monsoons in the Ethiopian highlands, which went actually to the leeward side of the mountains as the Nile. And then he comes actually in the rain shadow of the monsoons, and then crosses here the Hindu Kush mountains and enters India. So this is actually this whole mountain range, which is a barrier to the monsoon rains that come in from the southeast. And this is what he came into. And boy, he did not know what hit him. And he had to actually, in some sense, basically constructed his own defeat by trying desperately to separate water from land in a place where wetness consumed him. But eventually, he basically turned back, and they say that his men mutinied, and no historian actually says he was defeated, which is very interesting, actually. But he was, to some extent, in my mind, defeated by rain, defeated by the monsoon. And he turned away, but he had sown the seed of an imagination, a very lucrative dream he left behind. With this map, actually, you can see Eratosthenes' map, the man who coined actually the term geography. And after Alexander passed, this is in the 2nd century BC or 3rd century BC, you can see that the Ganges appears. Whereas here the Indus held the east end of the world, the Ganges appeared now to hold the east end of the world, but the Ganges is now a river. What we want to suggest actually that what was Ganga, a wetness that actually was everywhere, and then you tame it into a river actually called Ganges. Now these are terms, the names that are used interchangeably. I want to suggest that they are not the same. They are actually, one is rain, Ganges is rain, Ganga is rain, and Ganges is a river. But this is now the world that we have today. This is the dominating world of education, administration, a ground that requires a cultivated eye. It is why we all go to school, why we need to spend years learning geography, and interestingly, to some extent, perhaps why students fail geography. It's a discipline seeded in a particular moment when wetness can be made water. So I just want to take you through actually a few consequences of flows, and I'll rush through this if you don't mind. And I'll talk about it just in the context of the Ganges River. But the first is actually that once you call out a river with two lines, you also then have ecologies. You have riparian ecologies. You've got basically a natural thing. And for me, the definition of a natural thing is that you assume that animals see it. So an animal that comes there and actually sees a river, So once called out, you basically have you have a linear structuring of settlements on a river bank. And of course you have a structuring. These are spines of history, the spines of civilization, and the spines of settlement. Then once called out, you also have basically drains constructed to rivers, and rivers then become drains. So you teach children, rivers drain the land, and then they become drains. So we shouldn't be surprised at all. We have put water in the service of land. Then they become objects of veneration. I won't go into this. This is an interesting sculpture. Maybe I should just very briefly about it. This is supposed to be the descent of Ganga, and it's in Mahabalipuram in South India, 2,000 miles away from the Ganga, and done somewhere in the 6th, 7th century. But this particular sculpture, which depicts this, is not necessarily actually representative of that river 2,000 miles away. This is actually a rain cistern, and it overflows out there. And it comes down there. So we're just celebrating rain. It wasn't celebrating a river to begin with, but UNESCO promotes this now as basically the representation of Ganga, the river. They call it Ganga, confusingly. But then with this kind of imagination, once you call this out, you also go into the Sundarbans, which was mush, like that. And then you find the lines, and you separate land from water, and you get islands like this. Now, in a field of mangroves like this, you have constructed it into islands like this, thanks to the line that has now become a bund like this, that is about to collapse, and these people are, basically endangered. And the Dutch are here building this now in concrete, and so you must ask, actually, where did this paradigm come from? It wasn't actually the recent colonial efforts actually to define, to define islands and gather property. It came from much before, actually, with the line that generates the distinction between land and water. Then you get points too. At one time, if you look at medieval maps, basically so-called rivers, it started in mountain ranges. In mountain ranges like this, actually, or a mountain like this, which is Mount Kailash, which is a mountain of mountains, which is Tibet, the size of Western Europe, and with a height, actually, that is Mont Blanc, which is the highest mountain in Europe, if you think. And so this mountain now has been entered. You talk about the edge, and so you talk about the Himalayas, by the way, as an escarpment. It's an escarpment of this mountain, but today it's basically penetrated by surveyors in the 1700s to points like this, and so points like Gangotri now is considered the source of the Ganges. Imagine, in this millions and millions of possibilities, you get this one point that is singled out, and then you get this. Talk about the uncertainty of the Himalayas, Nikhil. This is where we got caught in this, actually, and we nearly died, and we were rescued by the army. But this is the world, actually, of the pilgrim going to that one point, and the collapse, actually, of the Himalayas is imminent. They are young mountains, actually. Once you draw a line, actually, between land and water, you can start looking at shifting flows. which is another rather childish preoccupation of people today, that, sort of looking at this, holding water in a place and then, your maps, and then you train rivers, and once you train rivers, you can link them, and then you can dam them. So here now, once you actually call out flows, you also basically extend them with channels and pipes and drains, and then interestingly enough, the channel and the river become basically both the cause and the solution of flood. So we are reinforcing this paradigm continuously and actually increasing our uncertainty. This is the world actually that we saw once in Sabarmati. It is not the Ganga actually, it's the western Ganga, if you will, where it was, one time it was dry, at one time the rain had come. It was like that. Gandhi gathered on this plain, and you see actually fairs that gather on this plain. The goats come at some time, people cultivate it, etc., etc. These people have been displaced now for a perennial water system, and water is brought from another river 200 miles away to actually fill this with water so that you can get real estate. And today it's crazy. Every city in India is after a river, because in order to have a riverfront, you have to have a river. Then you have this kind of a condition of a geographic surface. This is the Bharat Mata temple in Varanasi, where the shrine, if you will, is the map of India. And this was actually built in the 1930s and opened in 1936, and Gandhi was present at its thing, but it was designed in order to unite actually the people of India, and with this imminent nation state that was about to emerge, but the population did not associate with this nation state. So they basically made this temple and created the surface. But this surface now is so divisive because of communalism, because of territorializing. And you must remember actually that the river, interestingly, before it can be an object that unites, is an object that you have to possess. And so rivers now, I mean, if you think of the conflict between China and India, between Pakistan and India, between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and I mean, everywhere there's conflict for water and river water. Once called out, they really create a problem. And this will be the last that once you call out, you also have a being now that is living. Isn't this fascinating? This is a picture I took last year in Delhi, where this thing was flashing. So I took 4 images of it. Age being, tree, animal, river. So the river now has become this being a protected thing, like the Maoris. This thing, India has followed this example, and rivers have become so real that they become so alive. So Anu and I are basically working now on what it takes to inhabit and design in the moment of precipitation. To design not with a vocabulary of land and water, but with gradients of wetness. Now it's been 2,500 years since the line of separation was drawn, at least drawn self-consciously. 2,500 years in which a world has been constructed in support of this line. A nature, cities, civilization, a curriculum marked by disciplines, and of course an infrastructure of flows and flow reasoning that connects a past with a present and a future. It would be a shame if in the face of climate change, rising waters, and increasing flood events, we do not see the central role that academics have played and continue to play in promoting this line. A line that creates the problem when it confines wetness to a place as water in the service of land. And it would be a terrible shame if we continue to deploy this line uncritically, knowing that it is a choice and not a necessity. To recognize it as a choice is to make room for people who choose to anchor their existence in another moment. People who survive with considerable suffering in the cracks and interstices of a land-water surface. People who are uncritically labeled informal, underdeveloped, and poor. We need to turn to them for a non-dual imagination, steeped in a wetness that is everywhere to some degree. They inhabit the real ocean. Thank you.
I just don't know how I can really follow that, actually. So I was asked just to make a few discussant-style comments, so I will. And I will say that, start with a note of apology, in fact, actually, because I was reading the book manuscript that you so nicely sent me, and I got so enthusiastic about some of the ideas in it that I thought I would make a PowerPoint, because my response, as you'll see in a minute, is really about a kind of phenomenological understanding of wetness and dryness, also in India, but in a different part of India. And it was so fun looking at pictures of my river that I didn't actually get the PowerPoint together. So, but I have thousands of images. So I think I'm glad you left the water cycle up there, because I think I want to start with that. So if we look at the clay drawing of the water cycle, and Nikhil pointed out that I am also, besides an archaeologist, an environmental scientist, of course. So if we think about that, if you look at 3 and 4, that's water in its gaseous form, right? So the difference between, luckily we don't have to worry about ice in southern India at all, but the difference between liquid water and gaseous water is not the water we all know, right? It's the same. It's the amount of energy in the system, right? So it's wild and excited and flowing around. And I think that what contribution of this talk and this work that's really important is in the discussion of the time of reality as liquid being on the ground and that thing which is mapped and so on. Also, though, I think we could make a distinction not between the 4 parts, but between the 2 parts, the liquid, the water in its different states of matter. Okay, and I think that replacing or rethinking the focus from 1 here to rain, the moment of wetness, as they put it, I think this is very helpful, and it's particularly useful for India. So as most of us who are tuned to monsoonal patterns know, and we saw beautifully here, that there's a kind of moment in particular of anticipation of waiting for the monsoon rains that's very significant, very exciting. It's hot. You're just desperate for the water to come, for the rain, and there's a kind of joy in all of this. So I may look like a white middle-aged university professor, and of course I am, but my other life is actually I'm a farmer in North Karnataka, and this is one of the driest parts of India. It's nearly as dry as the Thar Desert. It's an area that receives less than 50 centimeters of rainfall annually. It's very, very dry. And so when I read this and listen to this discussion about profusion of wetness, and I think of Mumbai, there is in north interior Karnataka no profusion of wetness. And I've spent many years studying this. And there, I think, in this area, Bellary Raichur district, there is a significance of number 3 here of desiccation, of evaporation. This area is an area where there's too little water. There's almost never too much water. Water seems to fall. There are never rising waters practically, and it's very dry, right? So water may be everywhere, as we heard just now, but for the farmer with their rain-fed plot of intercropped millet and pulses, that's primarily what poor farmers grow, doesn't really see it that way. It doesn't seem to be a world of water. It doesn't seem to be a world enveloped by wetness or with profuse wetness at all. But it's absolutely the case, and I think this is a really important intervention here, that this farmer, my other life, where I've spent thousands of hours outside in North Karnataka, she looks to the sky, right, for rain, right, for water in its moderately structured state, waiting for those kind of excited diffuse particles of the gaseous form of water to calm down, to come down, and come to earth, okay? And I think that what's very interesting here, too, for me, is the connections between these movements of water and not only of water and land, but also of people, right? So we heard that keeping water in its place in terms of drawing lines and imagining floods and so on is a kind of exercise of control that we see historically. But of course, also keeping water in its place is one thing, but water keeps people in their place. And I think that's in particular thinking about the work that I've done on the long-term history over the last 5,000 years in this extremely dry part of southern India. I think of that. So this is where really liquid water, I'd say, colludes with forms of inequality and excess. Because if we think about rain, as we just saw now, rain is democratic, right? Rain falls on everyone. But once water in the form of rain and the earth meet, then really I would say that the relations of power structure that kind of interaction, right? So liquid water, it doesn't have the kind of wild energy of water vapor that allows it to escape human control, as we can see also, or to be mapped. But liquid water, after it falls, can be contained, right? It is sometimes commodified, but even if it's not, for example, if I'm a North Karnataka farmer in the Iron Age, that's about 1200 BCE to 300 before Alexander. We can also see that water can be separated, it can be segregated, and it can be made differentially meaningful. And this is something we definitely see happening in the archaeological record, right? And so this, in turn, this separation of water from land, which, I'm sure is not mapped, but is significant to people, it means that people, and also plants and animals, can be excluded from it and from land, right? That people can become themselves polluting of the water, and they can experience liquid water not in its sort of welcome democratic form of rain, but in the soil, differentially moist soil, which has significant differences for agricultural possibilities, in the reservoir or tank, in the canal, in the well, and then, yes, also I would say in something that we can or cannot call a river, that the person can or cannot bathe in, drink water from, cook with, or water their crops with, right? So it's the differential access and differential meaningfulness of water are manifested only in certain moments of this cycle, which I think is important point. So in the work that we did we did 10 years of systematic archaeological survey, which is a very weird thing to do. You have a group of 5 or 6 or 3 sometimes people spaced 20 meters apart, walking systematically back and forth across the landscape, following completely arbitrary lines like north and south, and drawing a lot of walking lines, and drawing lines, making maps and documentation. This is something that farmers find a very strange activity, and people would call out things to us like, the path is over there, you're missing the gate. Why are you walking back and forth across my field? But by walking back and forth across the fields and documenting things, we also get a very kind of, I would say, phenomenological sense of the significance, a sort of the feeling of different kinds of water and land. And that is to say that it's very difficult to cross a muddy field. It's almost impossible to cross a rice paddy. So you have to walk very carefully on the little embankments between the paddies. Sugarcane, which is also an irrigated crop, is virtually impossible to get through. And there are a lot of snakes in the cane, and sometimes other things. And we also the thing that we hated to survey the most were banana plantations, because banana plantations they're all irrigated, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Have little canals wandering, in and among the bananas, and so there's muddy. There's a lot of deep mud that goes in, up to about the knees, and then it's hard to get across those little canals. So we would jump across them sometimes, or we would, imagine boats and things that would get us across them. So there is a kind of significance of water in its and its confluence, I'd say, with soil, that not only makes possible producing different crops, but also in the kind of way in which people can move across the landscape. And I think that this is significant because it's those areas where you have the wet, muddy soil, and so where you have the high quality crops, and those are the only places where we find things like fences. So this is a difference, really, say, that makes a difference. So irrigated land supports entirely different crops than the crops like the under rain-fed reservoirs or under rain, just simply rain. And before the introduction of electricity and bore wells in the area, the difference between these different agricultural regimes was really the river. So this is an area where there's only one perennial river, the Tungabhadra River. The Tungabhadra is a small river that is formed by the confluence of the Tunga and the Bhadra. It's a tributary of the Krishna. And like many rivers in the Indian Peninsula, it's very braided, has lots of channels, and they go in and out like that in a very rocky bed. So this is an area that, this is a river that the only way in which perennial irrigation for rice, bananas, sugarcane, so on is possible is from this river. Okay, I'm almost finished. So beginning around 2,000 years ago, the river water of the Tungabhadra was used to support early rice farming through floodwater recession. So just as we saw with the Nile, the river rises and falls, sorry. But we know that by the 10th century or so, CE, there were canals cut into it, and certainly by the 14th to 16th century, there were large programs of building of aqueducts, canals, and dams to create these canals. So the water was no longer allowed to rise and flow in the same kind of fall in the same kind of way, and this controlling of water, this creation of lines on the landscape, created new kinds of possibilities. It creates food for elites and food for gods, but not for most people, including those people farming those fields of millets and pulses and looking to the sky for those democratic rainfalls because they're very far away from the river. So the river, the point I'm trying to make very inarticulately, I think, is that the river and other kind of contained forms of water do certain kinds of work, right? And I've only talked about farming, but they do other kinds of work as well, religious, transportation, drinking water, and so on. But liquid water in the form of rain can't do that same kind of work, nor can clouds or water vapor, right? So there is a way in which I think the kind of ontological ambiguity around the notion of the river itself, which maybe didn't come out so much in the talk, but definitely in the book, is, I think, very significant and very important. And the move towards looking at the rain as a kind of moment of wetness, I think is important. So just now we heard, I wrote down this quote, once called out, flows drain a land that can be propertied, territorialized, and communalized. But it's also the case then that it's not only the land that can be propertied, territorialized, and communalized, as I was trying to say, but it's really the flows that can also be propertied, territorialized, and communalized. Mm-hmm. So when rain comes down and let's call it a democratic form, it eludes this kind of capture. But we can see over the long historical term in southern Asia, in southern India, and particularly in a place where water is very scarce, that it's the flows themselves. It's only water in its number 2 form here that allows for these kinds of relationships to be engaged with it. So it's a lot to think about, and I got a little too enthusiastic, I have to say. So I didn't get to show you pictures of, the dry and the wet and the edges of the river and so on as I thought I might. So we'll have to have that conversation another time. But thank you very much for that really fascinating and provocative work.
About 15 minutes for, maybe 10 minutes actually, for questions. Can we take a couple of questions and you can respond to everything together? Or?
The problem is almost worse than you described, because throughout civilization, people have wanted to live near these areas of maximum wetness, and they forced the lines and really made sure. And they have good reason for it, because it provides for the economy and their livelihood. It gives them recreational opportunities. It's a very pretty place to live. How do you begin to change these kinds of things so that people live differently? In the past, we've either allowed disasters to happen, built higher walls, or just pushed everybody back. So those seem to be the solutions. You look to think areas like swamps or the Amazon basin where people live in a wetness kind of place. and sort of survive that way. But that's not appropriate for a set of million people, I think. What do you suggest? Was this sort of the bottom line question of all this data that's being collected and so forth, combining technology? But I'll jump to it. You have an answer.
Dilip, do you want to collect another question, maybe?
Sorry?
I think we're going to collect a couple, right?
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question on the sort of designing for wetness front, and maybe connecting to the introduction that Bethany and Nikhil were making about questions of kind of comparison. I was struck by the traumatic moment of the floating sculpture collapsing that reminded me of Cunha Adeyemi's floating school in Lagos that also collapsed, and I think it was also traumatic for some who had an investment in that. It seems like this floating utopian structure is one of the kind of circulating design solutions or suggestions to designing wetness. So I'm kind of particularly interested about where that would fit in your thinking about what sort of design imperatives this presentation sort of gives rise to.
Can I quickly jump in? So I have actually read also the manuscript, and I draw a lot from your work. So and in some ways you trained me how to, like your work trained me, both your work trained me how to look at the archive. One thing I was struck by was, and I was thinking of the relation between energy and living close to water. One thing I was struck by when I was looking at early settlement records around the Bengal Delta, they were talking about how people, exactly what you showed us where Gandhi was coming to do his thing, how people would have summer markets there, and then they would have the winter market, monsoon and post-monsoon market would go away, and then and there was always this movement, and they talk about how difficult it is to tax these markets because they're constantly shifting, and you see a distinct change from 1840s, 50s, where the markets start slowly coming towards the river, and you understand there's a complete change in the energy transport and energy system has already beginning. The steamboats are coming into for inland trade, and I wonder, like, how do we rethink? And I completely take this rethinking, but it has to be perhaps also connected to energy, because we've started living close to water because it's cost efficient in some ways. So I was wondering if you could link that up.
I mean, one of the things, I must say at the outset, that it is one thing actually to make evident that the line between land and water is an act of design, and that opens up the imagination to other possibilities. It's quite another thing to actually come up with solutions to the current world problems. And when I'm often asked this kind of question, I say it's taken 2,500 years to get into this mess. Give us another 2,500 to get out of it. So I mean, it's but I think the point that I think is more important to make is what would actually constitute a world, and a reality in another moment. And the lot has been destroyed in the 2,500 years since Alexander came. And it is amazing the kind of archaeological evidence that I have found in the Gangetic Plain, and how much that is actually read through the perspective and lens of a river and water. So I sort of understand that it is very difficult to talk outside of the language of land and water, but I think we should all make an effort, at least, given that, if one is convinced that line is not just a line that divides land and water, but it's a line that creates them. It's a metaphysical act of separation through wetness that then produces land. So when I'm thinking water, I'm thinking not land. This, I guess, is the basic dialectic. And if I'm thinking land, I'm thinking not water. But that's not true of wetness. So, and I'm glad actually that you bring up the Deccan. One of our earlier works, I think that Nikhil mentioned, is a book with Anu called Deccan Traverses. And over there, actually, we find tank systems. In tank systems, actually, are rain-holding systems that people today, interestingly, are desperately trying to make into flow systems. Now, when I say actually holding systems, tank systems are holding systems that then, once they gather enough, there's a sluice actually that it overflows into fields. But think now, if I may ask you to, of a holding system that is more field-like and not linear, but field-like. So I gather water, rain that falls on water. I also slip between wetness and water sometimes. But if I gather the rain actually in fields, and those fields actually are, manipulated by buns, mud buns, I actually, and wherever I break them, they overflow into the next field, and they overflow in the next field. And when they come down to the sort of lowest relative point of a surface, actually, it moves into another tank. In this whole transition, I don't have any blue and brown. I just have fields. And I cultivate even what the British called out, at least what map makers called out, actually as a river. It's never a river in India. Actually, it's always a cultivated nalla. And the nalla today has been made into a drain precisely because it was made into a river system. Now, you mentioned the Tungabhadra. The Tungabhadra I could see actually as a rain system. It's a rain that actually gathers and overflows, and as it approaches actually certain conditions, and when the rain is heavy enough, actually, it looks like a river that is between two lines, but it is just the highest overflow. So I can look at basically the ground, if you will, as an overflow system rather than a flow system. But I prefer the word a holding system rather than a flow system. And what is fantastic is that if you go into some of these places where these field cultivations, you will find that wells have been dug, actually, and that wells that have been, that are ancient wells that actually send rain into the earth, speed up rain to the earth, and actually extend the thickness of wetness in the earth. But today, all those wells have been killed, actually, because of this linear system, because you're seeing rivers as surface systems and not depth, and it's basically killed the depth of things. So the non-linear structuring, actually, of rain allows for a much more complex manipulation, if you will, or handling of wetness than just actually a river system. So, I'm sure that you have a lot of facts actually that suggest that the Tungabhadra is a river, but I would beg to defer actually in the considering the possibility actually of the Tunga and the Bhadra actually being rain systems, actually, and holding systems that just maximized, it basically reach a stage of maximizing overflows. But this then comes with actually what the river has done actually in moving people into so-called dry areas. Like I said, if you go into so many desert environments, you don't depend on pipe water systems and you don't depend on rivers, but you depend on dew. You use a canal system to actually work with dew. You have other ways of actually gathering wetness. But today, the river has made it possible to take water anywhere. And today, if I go into the Thar Desert, as we went last year, I find them growing rice just because water is being made available actually from the canal systems that come from the Yamuna system, and with the Yamuna now is being connected to the Ganga system. So there is a violation actually of so-called rain sheds by pipe water systems that allow for this. So I found this sort of interesting distinction. This thing of when you speak of water keeps people in their place. It's interesting how we have encouraged a certain mobility and a certain thing by channeling water across watersheds, and facilitated settlement anywhere on earth today, and one must seriously ask, is that what we are, we can't accept things like this and then also accept rising waters, as a condition now and a problem that we resolve while actually maintaining this kind of, freedoms that have been brought about actually by, basically what I'm saying is it's a difficult question, but it is certainly more a political one, and one that has actually involved choice in the early stages. I mean, the idea of energy, I mean, and the notion of a flow, comes actually with the notion of a flow system. And I mean, I can actually answer that. I mean, there are many other ways actually that one can turn to rain actually for energy that does not involve flow of water, but actually wetnesses that work in multiple ways. But I don't think I have the time to get into something like that. But this is just to provoke a design imagination in all of us, but also to provoke the fact that the line is an intention and an act of design, and that's where design begins, and that's where inquiry begins.
Thank you so much. I'm Liz, who I have a feeling I don't have the most up-to-date job listing for. Liz, do you want to announce that?
This is starting as assistant professor in planning at UCLA.
So, super congratulations to Liz. Prior to that, and what she's finishing currently is a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at MIT in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. She researches the social, political, and cultural dimensions of urban climate change adaptation. Her first book is soon to appear with the University of Chicago Press and is entitled Retreat: Moving to Higher Ground in a Climate-Changed City. And it's based on fieldwork and interviews she conducted over 4 years in the New York City borough of Staten Island, where, as many of us know, residents organized after Hurricane Sandy in favor of relocating and returning their waterfront neighborhoods to wetlands rather than rebuilding. She has appeared really committed to public engagement, and her work has been featured in Public Culture and in The New Yorker. She's also spoken with New Orleans Public Radio and on my very favorite WNYC show with Brian Lehrer. So Nick Pevsner is with us. We're lucky to have him here at Penn, where he teaches full-time like Anu, in the Department of Landscape Architecture in the School of Design. He teaches course studios in urban design as well as elective studios on the territorial landscape potential of energy infrastructure. He also is the co-editor-in-chief of Scenario Journal, an online publication facilitating the emergent interdisciplinary conversations between landscape architecture, urban design, engineering, and ecology. His research focuses on the public and civic potential of infrastructure and on the integration of urban ecological systems and their metrics into design methodology. Liz, over to you.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'll try to speak up. I'm recovering from a post-AAG conference loss of my voice, so if you can't hear me, just wave and I'll drink more coffee and talk louder. Thank you so much, Bethany. Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Nick. Thanks for organizing this workshop and for including me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation on rising waters. So today I'll share a snippet from my own engagement with this topic, looking at the meaning made of rising waters in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, when residents of one of the most politically conservative parts of New York City, the borough of Staten Island, where I took this picture during my fieldwork, organized to undertake one of the most radical responses to the storm, organizing effectively to disperse themselves and to unbuild their waterfront neighborhoods. And so my paper for this workshop more specifically explores how people work collectively to adapt to climate change without talking about climate change. But first I'll give some background just for those of you who aren't familiar with this case, and for those of you who are, just bear with me for a couple of minutes. So Hurricane Sandy struck the East Coast on October 29th, 2012, as many of you might recall. In New York City, where I was living at the time, working on my PhD, the borough of Staten Island was especially hard hit. It saw the highest recorded water levels, the most deaths, and the greatest proportion of residents affected of any borough. And this picture here shows the same neighborhood in that first photo, the neighborhood of Oakwood Beach. And you can see some houses were swept entirely off their foundations and into the surrounding marsh. 1 week after the storm, this letter to the editor was published on the website of Staten Island's daily newspaper. The letter's author, Tina Downer, wrote about the decades she'd spent in Oakwood Beach and how she loved her neighborhood, but had decided after Sandy that it was no longer a safe place to live. Soon after her letter appeared, Tina helped organize a neighborhood meeting. She invited, along with some other residents, just a group of their neighbors, so they barred public officials and the press. And at that meeting, more than 200 Oakwood Beach residents showed up. And to Tina's surprise and the surprise of other people present, they reached a near unanimous agreement to pursue a buyout of their homes. So what this meant was that rather than stay and rebuild after the storm, they wanted the government to pay them enough to relocate, to then demolish their damaged houses and restore wetlands in their place, prohibiting future development forever. And after that meeting, Tina and others formed a group called the Oakwood Beach Buyout Committee, and they put together a plan for buyouts, and they started pushing it to local, city, and state officials. Less than 3 months later, New York State's Governor Andrew Cuomo came to Staten Island and announced his support for a pilot buyout of their neighborhood, offering to pay homeowners who participated the pre-storm value of their damaged houses. Climate change is real, the governor said. There are some parcels that Mother Nature owns. He praised Oakwood Beach residents for coming together and for deciding it was time to move to higher ground. Soon, I watched as other shorefront Staten Island neighborhoods began organizing their own buyout groups, pushing the state to expand its program to include them too. This is a picture I took in Ocean Breeze. It's just a little bit up the shore from Oakwood Beach. The sign says, Governor Cuomo, Ocean Breeze needs your buyout. This is from a meeting in Crescent Beach, just down along the shore. Governor Cuomo, desperate, will work for buyout. Crescent Beach Buyout Committee. This is from South Beach up near the Verrazano Bridge. One of the signs says, Governor Cuomo, senior, sick, tired, broke, buy me out, please. And this is from Graham Beach, where one man put signs all around his house asking for a buyout. This one says, Governor Cuomo, Mother Nature wants her land back. Buy us out and give it back. So in the weeks and months after Sandy, all along the shore, residents began mobilizing for buyouts. And as I said, organizing effectively to disperse themselves and their communities, to demolish neighborhoods that some had called home for generations. They were mobilizing for what's become known among climate change adaptation professionals as managed retreat. It's the relocation of people and unbuilding of land in places vulnerable to effects of climate change, such as flooding and sea level rise. And after Sandy, there were a number of scientists who were also publicly advocating this approach in op-eds like the one here by Dr. Oren Pilkey, who advised that rebuilding with climate change in mind must also mean considering retreat, an idea that's long been viewed as too radical and unpopular to even broach, let alone begin to implement. It's generally the case that even people in places that suffer recurrent disasters do not relocate, and post-disaster policies likewise remain geared towards rebuilding homes and infrastructure where they were before. But in Staten Island, by contrast, the notion of moving away from the water became surprisingly popular, raising a host of questions for me, who's someone more used to studying how people fight to stay together, fight to preserve the places where they live, rather than fight to leave them. So when it came to what was motivating this mobilization for retreat, climate change might seem at first like an obvious answer. Sandy, after all, was quickly taken as a sign of what to expect with worsening warming by many in government and the media, and Staten Islanders' push for retreat has often been represented in news stories as a push for adaptation to future conditions. But as I began my fieldwork, I quickly realized that as block after block and neighborhood after neighborhood were organizing and mobilizing in favor of buyouts, one thing they weren't talking about was climate change. I'm sure 90% of people who had a buyout didn't believe in climate change, a leader of one local buyout group told me. And regardless of the accuracy of his estimate, it was definitely the case that climate change practically never came up in the meetings that I attended over 4 years, nor in the interviews I conducted, unless I asked about it myself, which I often waited to do for about an hour into a conversation. And then I would say something like, as you and your neighbors are deciding whether to stay or to go, are people talking about climate change? And invariably the answer was no, or not in this neighborhood. So much scholarship on climate change denial seeks to explain inaction, asking why, despite long-standing scientific consensus on the causes and threats of warming, so little has been done to address the problem and to respond to its impacts. And in the US, of course, a powerful industry-funded campaign has dedicated itself for decades to sowing doubt, fomenting polarization, and obstructing policy. But as sociologist Kari Norgard found in her ethnography of a Norwegian village, even high levels of individual knowledge, belief, and concern about climate change may in practice manifest little differently than full-on denial. Norgard found that despite villagers expressing ample private worry about climate change, it never became a matter of public concern. So people avoided thinking about it, they didn't talk about it, and they certainly did not mobilize in response to it, even as they began to feel the effects of impacts that included extreme weather and increasingly late snowfalls. Analyzing what she calls the social organization of denial, Norgard draws on Nina Eliassoff, who showed the collective work it takes to produce political apathy. As Eliassoff wrote in her book Avoiding Politics, it can be as difficult to ignore a problem as to try to solve it. On Staten Island, people were both ignoring a problem and actively trying to deal with it. And this conjoining of climate change adaptation and climate change denial is what legal theorist Katrina Fisher co-terms agnostic adaptation, which she defines as adaptation without the why, the divorce of adaptation from knowledge or acceptance of climate change being humans' fault. So in the time I have left, I want to explore the everyday work of making adaptation agnostic by delving deeper into the production of denial through the buyout process, examining how and why people manage to organize and mobilize around a retreat without talking about climate change and to what effect. So the easy explanation for agnostic adaptation in Staten Island centers on the political ideology and partisan identity of its residents. Staten Island, as I said, is known for being the most conservative borough of New York City, and this is especially true along the east and the south shores, where the mobilization for buyouts took place. So as you can see from this map, upwards of 70% of voters along the shore voted for Trump in the recent presidential election. But these neighborhoods are by no means politically or ideologically homogenous, and I found that when asked, people expressed to me a diverse range of views about climate change, so everything from avowed denial to alarmed concern. And what they shared was an understanding that climate change was a polarizing issue, and bringing it up could be difficult without being seen as taking a divisive stance, and that's something that people generally are hesitant to do, but they especially were hesitant to do in this context because they knew that garnering and sustaining neighborhood-wide support for buyouts was key to winning support from the state. You don't want my own views on climate change, one woman told me when I asked. It's become just totally a political football. Many people I spoke with took care to equivocate, like this woman from Oakwood Beach, who, when I asked whether she and her neighbors wanted to move because they thought a storm like Sandy would happen again, said, "It seems to be a global trend, not that it's global warming. I don't want to be jumping on any theory bandwagon." So if climate change was, in one man's words, the third rail, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, he said, what were people talking about instead? And what can attending to these ways of talking about climate change without talking about climate change tell us about the meaning of denial in a time of rising waters? So there were, I found, two main ways that people spoke about environmental change without talking about climate change. They often spoke, as depicted in this sign, about the need to give land back to Mother Nature, and relatedly about the problem of recurrent and worsening flooding. So while climate change, when invoked, is often a topic that serves to shift attention to the future, talk of flooding and Mother Nature redirected it towards the past, calling to mind experiences and memories that residents held in common. As the woman from Oakwood Beach told me, after saying she didn't want to jump on any theory bandwagon, you need to go back to really understand why we are pursuing a buyout. The history to it brings us to where we are today, and why. This history was one of storms and floods. But as residents stressed, the risk was not wholly natural, but rather produced over time, as neighborhoods that once looked like this, bungalows built on pilings in the marsh, the line between land and water very fluid, were redeveloped with a building boom that accompanied the 1964 opening of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, after which the population living along Staten Island's shore soared. And so the neighborhood where those girls once stood on a dock now looks like this. And it looks like this after any kind of heavy rainfall. This is not a picture from Sandy. As one woman who lives in this neighborhood explained to me, over the years, she said, the city allowed development, and they allowed them to fill in the creeks and the wetlands and build on them. So now the water's a problem because it doesn't have its natural places to go anymore. This, she said, is a problem that was created. Sharing the story of the past gave residents who were generally opposed to government intervention the sense that their claim for buyouts was a legitimate one. From our point of view, one man told me, the government is at least partially complicit in this. You're due some liability. Focusing on the impending threat of climate change, people felt, risked not only eliding this history, but also potentially shifting responsibility away from government and onto individuals. So as one man told me after explaining that he personally did not believe in climate change, I know there's loads of people out there that believe in it. And okay, you can believe in it, but so what's the answer? To tax the people more? To make us pay more? He was eager to talk about the problem of worsening flooding and to blame, in his words, greedy developers and the politicians who made it worse. But he was loath to frame that problem as primarily one of climate change, which he believed would feed into a government agenda to further shift risk onto people like himself. And indeed, at the time of our interview, the rising cost of climate change-fueled disasters was being invoked as a reason to cut public subsidies for flood insurance and to raise premiums to market rates that threatened to force those who were unable to pay out of their homes, and that was many people in these neighborhoods. Meanwhile, New York City's mayor, Michael Bloomberg at the time, used the threat of climate change to advance his plans for a more resilient waterfront, for more redevelopment on the city's already rapidly gentrifying coastline. It wasn't necessary to share the Oakwood Beach man's conservative politics to share his concern that all the talk of climate change after Sandy had the potential to unjustly deflect accountability for the storm. So I spoke to an editor at the city's public radio station, which is kind of on the other ideological end of the spectrum to the talk radio that this man in Oakwood Beach listened to. And the reporter there expressed similar concerns to me about the tendency to frame Sandy in terms of climate change in outlets such as this one, Bloomberg Business Week. This is the first post-storm issue of that magazine. As the reporter and editor pointed out, he said, if you say this is a probabilistic problem, that Sandy was due to happen at some point and we totally underprepared for it, it's a real indictment of government. Whereas if we say, it's climate change, we never experienced something like this before, we could never have expected it before, it lets current government office holders off the hook. Talking about giving land back to Mother Nature not only focused attention on who was responsible for taking it from her in the first place, it also made retreat feel like a locally meaningful act, a way of restoring a past landscape and righting past wrongs. And this proved a particularly powerful narrative. And in the aftermath of Sandy's trauma, it also bears noting that giving land back to Mother Nature held a very different emotional resonance than the notion of giving in to rising seas or giving up in the face of climate change. In Staten Island, retreat was not equated with defeat, as it so often is in discussions of climate change and adaptation. Rather than signaling an abandonment of community or identity, participating in the buyout effort acted to affirm a collective ethos. As one woman who sought a buyout put it, if this is an area that takes in water, that becomes a sponge, that goes back to nature, everybody wins. It's a hell of a sacrifice for the greater good. But in this case, not everybody won. Those who succeeded at getting resources to adapt to climate change without talking about climate change were predominantly white, middle and working class homeowners, many of them cops, firefighters, sanitation workers, and other unionized city employees. And they had the political power and connections to get their demands heard, and at least to some degree met by the system as it stands. They possessed what anthropologist Elizabeth Marino terms adaptation privilege, afforded through policies like buyouts that are premised on property ownership and by extension on whiteness, thereby acting to reproduce and compound racialized inequality through the process of adaptation. So on the one hand, discourses of denial in Staten Island worked in part to resist the positioning of climate change as the depoliticized responsibility of either elite technocrats or affected individuals, instead rendering it the subject of democratic debate and collective action. These discourses of denial also reflected and reinforced residents' relative power, enabling some to access resources to retreat to relative safety while remaining silent on a problem whose impacts are disproportionately borne by others. In the aftermath of last summer's hurricanes, the White House requested billions of dollars in funds for flood resilience and large-scale buyouts, without, of course, talking about climate change. And it's safe to say these funds will not be distributed equitably. But this is not solely a problem of the present administration or adaptation that's agnostic just about climate change. Rather, it directs attention to other forms of denial and silence that imbue adaptation more broadly. For instance, the, quote, sustained silence The geographer Dean Hardy and his colleagues identify in climate policy about the role of racism in constructing landscapes of uneven risk, a form of denial they call colorblind adaptation planning. And I've written elsewhere about how it was not only climate change that was erased in the story of retreat most residents told, but also that central role that racism played in Staten Island's development and subsequent fight against overdevelopment that prefigured the fight for retreat. But for now, suffice it to say that looking closely at the problem or the production of agnostic adaptation in Staten Island reveals the multifaceted character of denial, imbued with politics, emotion, and unequal relations of power, as well as widespread desire for a sense of agency and control in the face of a starkly uncertain future.
Thank you so much, Liz. It was such a pleasure to read your paper. I hope you'll excuse me, I prepared some written remarks just to keep it to 10 minutes. But I think I'll close out with a couple of larger questions that maybe we can toss around in Q&A. So I think Liz's paper crystallizes in many ways the difference between the psychology of climate adaptation versus climate mitigation, how one is a local issue, the other a global collective one. And while it may be easier to galvanize action to collectively adapt to climate change, long before we get the societal will to collectively mitigate its causes, right? And so I really appreciated, Liz, your kind of outlining of the various rationales that Staten Islanders used. There's the desire to hold one's community together after a traumatic event and not talk about climate change as a way to not kind of reopen traumas outside of one's control as people yearn for normalcy and safety and community. There's the kind of socially constructed silence around the topic, where you cite Kari Norgard from Norway. I think in a similar vein, climate communicator George Marshall in his 2014 book, Don't Even Think About It, has cited many other examples from US media and politics of how climate change explicitly goes unmentioned because it is so socially and societally divisive. It's typically not addressed by editorial pages, not by people at parties. Don't want to be a party pooper, right? Not by scientists, not by traditional environmentalists, who sometimes prefer to focus on a kind of more more acceptable ideas such as green jobs or energy independence rather than tackling climate change head on. There's this idea of giving land back to Mother Nature, and you note how Governor Cuomo, in talking to the buyout community, even he for whom Hurricane Sandy in many ways became this galvanizing force that made Cuomo much more visible on climate change mitigation policy in the state of New York. When talking to the community, Governor Cuomo couches this event in the language of Mother Nature. And while this kind of nature language from both local residents and politicians might sound like a cop-out, I actually think it's helpful here to parse out a little bit of the details of what the risk in Staten Island actually entailed. In many ways, the distinction I'd like to make is the difference between storm surge flooding and sea level rise. Storm surge has long occurred, is indeed periodic, and one does not need to believe in human-caused climate change to believe that they've been the victim of a hurricane-driven storm surge. Sandy, in many ways, became symbolic for climate change advocates, as the Bloomberg business cover showed, precisely because it was a salient moment of talking about something that breaks through the social construction of silence, and as a way to maybe steer that conversation. And residents might have been forgiven for being defensive about not becoming a political football. While hurricanes and storms may make the threat of sea level rise more salient for some, the science of trying to attribute hurricanes and storms explicitly to anthropogenic climate change is actually a really new science. And this science of attribution has come into its own really just in the last several years after the occurrence of Superstorm Sandy. And we saw maybe the first very public rolling out of attribution science in the wake of hurricanes Harvey and Maria and Certainly the threat of sea level rise caused by climate change exacerbates and increases flooding risk, especially in low-lying communities. Yet the threat that these communities faced in Superstorm Sandy was different, as you point out, because of the kind of long-standing problem of developing low-lying areas. And so it kind of makes sense that residents would be unwilling to absolve city government of blame in what these residents considered coastal development malfeasance, right? Of officials not recognizing the coast as a dynamic natural system and willing instead to be an inert piece of tabula rasa real estate. For designers who were looking to be more attuned to the dynamics of natural systems, as early as 1969, for example, landscape architect Ian McHarg had mapped the suitability of Staten Island's East Shore for development, and his maps explicitly avoided certain areas due to the threat from tidal inundation and coastal flooding, which pretty much lined up with the neighborhoods that flooded during Sandy. And I think a lot of people after the storm kind of juxtaposed McHarg's maps with the flood maps. Developing in a floodplain doesn't need climate change to be dangerous. It just needs one to ignore the logics of hydrology, topography, and infrastructural failure. Blaming climate change would absolve municipal planning, or in some geographies, the Army Corps of Engineers. This creation of vulnerability has a long history from the development of the lower Ninth Ward in the historic back swamp of New Orleans, which became a predominantly lower income community of color, which was washed away when the levees broke during Katrina, or the 14,000 subdivision houses in Houston built inside the Addicks and Barker reservoirs while city officials looked the other way, and which flooded recently during Harvey. That said, the agency given to nature by everyone from local residents to politicians, rather than to topography or storm surge models, say, speaks to a mysticism that I think obscures the basic environmental comprehension of the factors that determine risk. And so, nature, unlike some of the quotes from the residents, has no intention, no innate condition, and no regenerative capacity. It's a cultural construct. And so any agency ascribed to nature reflects a convenient lack of comprehension of the basic mechanisms of the natural processes themselves that I think kind of agnostic adaptation tries to cover over. I really love this term, agnostic adaptation. There's plenty of examples of contemporary politics of agnostic adaptation. Liz points out one of these in the Trump organization's planning for a sea level wall at Mar-a-Lago. So maybe we can call this out instead as climate hypocrisy. Yet while the actions of the current president may embrace agnostic adaptation for his personal property, the current administration's scrapping of the kind of larger set of Obama-era rules meant to consider climate change in the design of infrastructure investments, a stance whereby adherence to climate fiction is directly opposed to the fiscal responsibility of the inevitable damage due to climate hazard, and that's just a kind of a probability game. That represents a wholesale abdication of even engaging with climate risk. And so that's a very different scale of agnosticism. Finally, I really appreciate how Liz's paper deconstructs East Shore residents' whiteness as a power relationship, whereby the denial of climate change offers the white East Shore residents a shield of sorts against the, as you say, individualization of responsibility for climate change causation through the kind of more affluent outsized consumption that these residents might have enjoyed, as well as a resistance to the narrative of vulnerability to which this population did not belong, unlike the frontline communities of color that stand to suffer the most harm from climate change, as highlighted by climate advocates. These residents did not want to be seen as beneficiaries of environmental injustice, and one could make the case that even though they benefited financially from unequal positive treatment by municipal planning, by access to land, political representation, and social visibility, certainly this is not something that they wanted to highlight while organizing to be made whole by the state of New York. In her conclusion, Liz, you talk about this sustained silence, the quote from R. Dean Hardy, Richard Milligan, and Nick Hanen, describing as something that results in colorblind adaptation planning that ignores the historical production of vulnerability. which excludes communities of color from participating in the construction of a hopeful, sustainable future. I think that's a really key part of your argument. I guess it's a hopeful development then that some of the leading advocates of the climate action movement, organizations like 350.org and Greenpeace USA, have focused their mobilization narrative explicitly on climate mitigation, foregrounding vulnerable frontline communities of color, right? Pacific Islanders, Indigenous, Native, First Nations people, and socially vulnerable and low-lying communities of color. And thus maybe we're starting to see environmental justice permeate the traditionally much more kind of white and affluent space of the traditional environmental movement. And perhaps the beginning of an expanded alliance for climate action. Is there an opening here maybe for new kinds of imaginaries that include a broader coalition of people? New stories of adaptation. I think here of speculative fictions, of which Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140 is a very kind of high-profile recent one. Maybe because it's an early example of climate fiction, but really space here for other kinds of speculative fictions, and maybe where the nascent genre of Black futurism has much to offer for a different readership. One question I have is, what lessons do we draw from this example of a white enclave hit by Sandy in the aftermaths of hurricanes Harvey, Maria, and Irma, where the geographies of harm for each of these storms was different, and the abilities of communities to recover has been different as well between, let's say, Houston and Puerto Rico. Where in this conversation do we place ideas such as climate gentrification, highlighted by housing advocates in Miami already, whereby less affluent communities of color on higher elevation neighborhoods are starting to fear displacement by speculative real estate development, maybe extending these questions of affluence and influence. What lessons do we draw for the challenge of decarbonization when many of the strategies for climate mitigation may be focused in progressive enclaves and in very strong state actors like the People's Republic of California? But many of the policies will need to be enacted in the end across a broad swath of conservative heartland, also known as Trump country. And so in this age of climate denial, one often asked question is whether agnostic adaptation represents an opening with which to engage people directly in harm's way about the mechanisms and inevitability of climate change, even if their politics and kind of vision of the science don't align with seeing that. As a way of softly starting them on the road of embracing and advocating for climate change mitigation as well, and not just adaptation. Liz's paper clearly shows us that this may not be working, at least not yet. Perhaps in southern Florida, where nuisance flooding, whereby the groundwater is actually coming up out of backyards when the sky is completely blue, but just by virtue of tidal action and groundwater, maybe educating the lay public about the environmental mechanisms of climate risk. But in New York, and maybe also up and down the coast, actually where coastal vacation houses are insured at discount by the National Flood Insurance Program, we still have a long way to go until these kind of more politically resistant communities acknowledge their own climate risk, let alone their own climate privilege.
We'll open it up. We have a full 25 minutes for questions and discussion. I think since we do have a little bit of time, maybe we'll give Liz the chance to respond to Nick. And then, Liz, I'll just leave it to you to take questions as you like.
Oh, wow. There's so much in your response. Thank you. I was trying to write it all down as opposed to reflecting on it while you were saying it. But I think I'll just pick up on something you said at the end about climate gentrification, that I think is a really important point. And I was just actually in Miami not long ago presenting this, and it was the first time I'd really been there, and it was very interesting to present this work from kind of the Upper East Coast in a very different ecological context and political context, where the city officials there, and they were saying, you know, we have nothing besides property taxes. Like, we can't even be seen in this room having this conversation about retreat. It's much more of a threat to government there than it was in the New York context, where these kind of property taxes these places provide are like a drop in the larger bucket of resources. But there, some of the officials I was talking to actually were talking about how they had also recently sold their own homes and moved to neighborhoods like Little Haiti. And I think something that I'm trying to do in my future research is to track, where are people going? Because if it's people like these, and in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, actually, there were nearly 4,000 people in Harris County, in Houston, who called local officials asking to get bought out. And they're currently trying to do a much larger scale experiment in buyouts in Houston post-Harvey. And if it's going to be communities like these, and right now it's just purely a financial transaction, there's not a lot of thought about where people are going, then the kind of attention that's being paid to the impacts of rising waters just within this kind of flood zone area is ignoring the kind of larger ripple effects, as people with the most resources are the most able to move inland or to higher ground, and then it sets off these waves of further displacement. So I think it's really important to kind of expand that lens and think about where are people going, how do we follow them over the longer term, or are there situations where people that aren't getting support in the form of a buyout, which offered a lot of resources to the people that got it in Staten Island, are being pushed out through flood insurance and these other kinds of less visible ways and winding up in places that are further at risk, but it's just kind of displacing the risk and it's harder to see again. So yeah, I'll say that. Thank you for your comments.
Liz, do you consider other tools besides buyout?
And in this case, no, just mainly, I think thinking about like the limitation, buyouts are like the main tool for facilitating retreat here. And there's a lot of work thinking about their limitations and kind of ways of moving beyond buyouts. But in this case, it was primarily either buyouts or what's called acquisitions for redevelopment, which were the cities offer to people who wanted to move, but in places the city didn't want to see the land permanently unbuilt. So they offered roughly the same amount of money, but they got the right to sell the land on to developers to rebuild more resiliently rather than doing retreat. And this was very unpopular in general, because the land didn't go back to Mother Nature. But part of some of the conversations I'm having with people working in other sorts of policy contexts is what ways are there to rethink buyouts, what other kinds of, and also even the term retreat, which again sort of reinscribes this line between land and water in a way that's not sort of reflective of the kinds of ongoing relationships people want to have with that space and the kinds of more fluid uses they want to make of it and ways of living there.
In any of the buyout cases, was there a master plan of any sort developed by everybody to guide the process that was a little bit above the just individual political decision making?
In terms of where
you'd buy out, where you'd not buy out?
No, it was really prolonged and haphazard, I would say, where when this initial neighborhood organized, and they organized in a way where until this kind of pilot program was announced, not a lot of people knew this was happening. And I think once the state announced the pilot program, I think it's fair to say that they did not expect there to be this kind of dramatic ramp up of demands from other neighborhoods. If you look at like the first draft state action plan, there's sort of a line in there that's like, well, very few people are going to want to do this. People want to stay in their homes. That's like a known fact. And there wasn't really a coherent plan for how to scale this up. And then once there was such a large expression of interest in the program, then the city kind of stepped in and said, the state can't undevelop our whole waterfront. And they created their own alternate program, and it wasn't until really the mayor changed and there was this more of an opening. So it took about another 8 months after the first neighborhood was announced for the buyout for the next neighborhood to get it, and then one more neighborhood got it 4 months later, so more than a year after Sandy. And lots of people who are on the edges of those zones, people in these other neighborhoods that organized, felt very unfairly excluded. And part of that is, I think, the difficult thing with buyouts, which also depend on a disaster declaration. So this is simultaneously being framed as a way to adapt to future risk, but it's being created as a recovery program where people who maybe are in a different zone on the flood map or face a different level of kind of future risk of either sea level rise or storm surge or flooding, but suffered the same damage from this one storm event, don't feel as though they should be given different deals.
Do you know of any examples anywhere else where there's a good plan either to do it before or after a disaster?
No. I mean, I think there's a lot more thought now as the National Flood Insurance Program is being reformed, there have been proposals put forward to preemptively offer people buyouts and say, essentially, sign this, and if your house in the future is damaged more than 50% by a storm event, you will automatically receive a buyout. But there's not necessarily a plan for how that's going to work in different places, because again, depending on the size of, there's a lot of different kind of local contextual factors at play and other housing available, and not knowing in advance who that will be. So.
I really like this work, particularly because it's so surprising, right? And a number of different ways that you describe it. One axis being people that don't believe in climate change, think about adaptation. Nevertheless, the conversation with Nick was really productive, I think, in that sense. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the worlds that inform the surprise that is like desiring or claiming or organizing to be moved, community organizing to be moved outside of the community, right? Or outside of that space. What kinds of future communities are they imagining? Do they include the people that are their neighbors? Or, so that's again being a question of where people go. But also, what are the worlds around the community? Some of it's landscape issues, but I know you've also been thinking about questions of insurance maps and flood risk that make the unthinkable moving thinkable, right? Or and actionable in this particular case.
That's such a
Property
great question.
holding,
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions. And I think it kind of gets to one of the biggest puzzles for me that I didn't really talk about here, and I'm still kind of working through in the book, is why this, there are a number of reasons I identify why this mobilization happened in Staten Island, but not in other kind of similar parts of New York City, like Broad Channel or Garrettson Beach or Breezy Point, that are kind of similar demographically, politically, in terms of the housing type, in terms of the storm damage. And I think part of that relates to your question, and one thing that's incredible about Staten Island's topography is that it's where the terminal moraine is, so it's where the glaciers retreated, and it has some of the highest land on the eastern seaboard as well as this very low-lying land. So people can actually move 6 blocks further inland and be at like 60 feet elevation, and so they're able to move but simultaneously feel as though they're staying in their broader community. But that was, of course, for people who got the money relatively quickly, when pre-storm value still could buy you something like that in Staten Island. For people that were getting this money like a year or two after the storm, that no longer was an option necessarily. And I would say, talking to people afterwards, after they've moved, and it's still kind of an ongoing process, one thing that's striking is that I'll say, how are you doing? And they're like, I'm at 65 feet now, or I'm 6.1 miles from the water. And people have just like a really, really like precise sense that relates to this kind of fears of flood insurance, and just the sense that if I stay, suddenly it's like staying is a lot less certain, and the sort of security or whatever home meant for you is kind of gone if you stay, because you have to elevate, but the flood maps are being redrawn when Sandy hits. People don't know how high they have to elevate. Once the maps are finalized, they can change again in a couple of years, then you have to go up more. And there's, it's a much more uncertain situation actually than leaving. But one thing that's also distinct about this case compared to some other examples of kind of relocation or resettlement that are underway now in response kind of to climate change is the fact that people weren't trying to move together. And these are neighborhoods where there are kind of extended family networks, and that's something I would ask people when I spoke to them, is if, hypothetically that were an option, and there's a huge redevelopment happening on the North Shore. They're putting up a ton of new waterfront condos in Staten Island. It's like, if you were given like a floor of that building, would you want? And people just thought it was naive, or some people said, I don't even like my neighbors. But I think, people are kind of spreading out. They're moving, people move to Florida, interestingly, New Jersey, all around. But an important other thing about Staten Island is it's not a working waterfront. People's like primary identity that they talk about, because a lot of my interviews were about, why did your family or you move here in the first place? So I think to understand the meaning of what it means to leave, you have to understand the meaning of what it meant to be there. and to come there. And for them, it was about attaining this identity as a homeowner. And these are kind of second generation immigrants, largely, I would say, Italian mostly. And so, they didn't, at the time they moved over, largely in like the 70s, many people, the Parks Department budget was like non-existent. The city was in this kind of, crisis, and they were saying the beaches were actually dangerous. It was not an asset to live near the water. It was polluted. It was not something we moved here for. We moved here just for the house. So that was more the identity they were invested in maintaining through the move.
I think she had her hand up long ago, yeah? Okay. No, so thank you. I have a lot of questions, and I really liked the element of surprise you bring, and it's sort of like one of the things I kept thinking as you were talking about your project, and as you were talking how they want, your actors wanted to think of Sandy perhaps as a probabilistic event that the government would have predicted and protected. I kept thinking about also Nikhil and Bethany's presentation in the morning, the place of uncertainty and the question of inquiry and how you define. And I think there perhaps is a productive conversation, and you sort of come back to it and talk about what uncertainties you can live with and what you can't, and how you frame what is. I was wondering if you can link up this, and I think in your response it came up like this question of educating, question of knowing, question of training, question of getting rid of uncertainty, yet somehow perhaps I wonder if you can so what, and I wonder if Mother Nature stands for something over here much more than ignorance or something of that sort.
Thank you. I guess two things in terms of what uncertainties you can live with. I like the way of phrasing that. I think it gets back to something you were saying, and something that in this case, people were very invested in kind of the forgetting of the fact that, I think, Nikhil, you spoke about this one time when you were responding to my paper, that, they were only homeowners in the first place because of this government intervention and subsidizing of their ability to live there. And I think the kind of uncertainties, my sense that people found hard to imagine living with, was that dependence kind of being out in the open and being very because, the thought was, if I stay here and I'm just I will be dependent on government forever because I will get flooded again and again. My flood insurance will change, the maps will change. Suddenly I'm in this relationship that I felt as though I wasn't. And I think in terms of Mother Nature, one part that I wrote about in the paper, and you spoke about a little but I didn't talk about here, was the man who actually said, I know a lot of people believe in climate change, I don't, what's the answer, it attacks us more. He was kind of the most adamant, I would say, in terms of I'm an avowed denier, that is my identity, that's what I believe. And after we had a conversation in his house, he was actually just the other side of the street from where the buyout area stopped. So he had organized his block to try to get included, and he'd fought really hard to try to get included, and he wasn't in the end. So you could stand in his living room and look out over the parts of the neighborhood that were being unbuilt. And after we talked, he took me on a drive through the wetland, and he had been really distraught about not being part of this buyout. And suddenly he was like, well, I guess I just, depending on what happens to the land, and that's another question, is actually it still is very uncertain what will happen to these neighborhoods post-retreat, and there's kind of a fight ongoing about that. He said, maybe my house will recover enough value, or they'll put up a seawall and my flood insurance rate through it won't rise. But all I want to do is try to sell this house and get my family out of here. But I can't do that without the support of a buyout. And his son had run away from school, was having PTSD, had actually found a neighbor who had been, I think, his football coach who had died in the storm. And so there was just a lot of trauma from being there. And as we were driving around the wetlands that were kind of growing back in on the lots that had been unbuilt, this man said to me, since I've been here, I've seen this marshland burn to the ground 3 or 4 times, because this is actually also a wildland-urban interface. So they have these huge wildfires through this grass. That's another reason. People were like, we have fires, we have floods, there's a lot of reasons we don't want to be here. And he said, and then it comes back and it looks like this. And he's like, it's just so remarkable how nature is. And that power of nature, to him, he was like, that was something that was consoling him, that he could look out and sort of see that and hold on to that. And there's been some research done in Australia interviewing people who talk a lot about resist the idea of climate change and talk about the idea of natural cycles. And part of what they're resisting is that kind of deeper reassurance of humans not having control over everything, and this kind of power of nature. And that was something he spoke to very strongly when we talked.
I actually underlined your quote about him, where he's like kind of processing what it means to not have been bought out, and he's saying that, oh well, by knocking down those homes and bringing it back to nature, maybe we'll get a better buffer zone. So maybe that'll protect me next time. Just kind of like this narrative construction and coping mechanism as well.
Yeah, and really invested in sort of that proximate nature is the only thing that's kind of left to protect him in the absence of some kind of government help.
I want to make sure we get to the question at the end of the table.
Well, it, as always, so much fun to hear about this work. I wanted to ask you a question that actually sort of goes back to something that Dilip was saying before, so maybe also a question for you, which is, he was talking about this sort of unthinking these epistemologies of the land-water interface and how sort of ontological realities have arisen from the way that these boundaries have been drawn, and that something I found really fascinating thinking about his presentation in light of yours was that he was saying, we need to maybe turn to these sort of informal people to create these sort of non-dual imaginaries. And I was thinking that, what's interesting about your case, and especially as you're exploring the politics of sort of adaptation, gentrification, or whatever you might call it, is that the reason, the buyout is only possible for formal people. That, that in that first op-ed that you showed us, that these people were saying, like, we want a buyout and we are all homeowners. They're fundamentally, and it's only possible to have a buyout for formal people. And that the idea of sort of unthinking this space epistemologically or ontologically necessarily inscribes inequalities. And in that sense, it's sort of, there's, these are really actually different ways of thinking about what it means to unthink these boundaries, because, and I think that we see that also in, the Ganga Delta, that people who are at this space, or in Mumbai too, right? Like anyone who is at this space that is not formal is going to experience the unthinking in a different way from someone who is formal, just like, no one's unthinking Wall Street, right? Epistemologically or ontologically. So,
Daniel.
Yeah, except for Daniel.
Daniel.
So I wonder, how you might think about that in Staten Island. How, what's the impact of the buyouts for people who don't have formal entitlements to live at that interface?
It's such a great point and a great comment. And I think the Elizabeth Marino piece that I was citing that came out really recently in Global Environmental Change on adaptation privilege, she works in Shishmaref, and so she's really thinking through how buyouts are kind of reinscribing these sort of regimes of formality that are, excluding all these other ways of living in the face of climate change. And yeah, there were different kinds of kind of informalities. One big issue in terms of which neighborhoods were and were not bought out, I think, from the state's perspective, were the neighborhoods where there were a number of renters. And in this part of New York City, like many similar parts of New York City, a number of the renters are not, they don't have formal leases. They're living in kind of illegally subdivided parts of homes, and, after a storm like this, when, the landlord gets flooded, they're kind of displaced with no record, and there were a lot of issues with kind of informal leasing agreements after Sandy and renters. But then also one issue the state confronted, just in terms of the time it took for the process, is sort of how many of these houses, the majority, I would say, in the neighborhoods that were bought out, were originally these small bungalows that had been kind of winterized over the years, and in many cases it was someone's great grandfather had built it. There wasn't like a deed. It had there were sorts of not clear title, and the title issues became a huge thing in the process. And also a lot of people in this part of Staten Island are contractors. They do construction. They've been building their own homes, repairing their own homes, and expanding their own homes without permits for a long time. And so when they're getting their assessments suddenly from the state, I talked to one woman from the state, and she said, oh, you know what a Staten Island deck is? It's like a Long Island. It's like a deck that, your uncle put up, but there's no, when you look at the official floor plans of these homes for what the assessment and offer is being made based on, they bear very little resemblance to the houses that are actually there that people think they should be getting paid for. So yeah, a lot of kind of different forms of informality, some of which, were, all kind of came into play through the process.
We're slowly going to get back on time, but Daniel has been waiting patiently for one last short question remark, and a short question remark then from you, and then we'll take a very brief break, not the full 15 minutes that you were promised. Sorry. More frustration. Daniel.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Liz. This is fantastic. Okay, so very briefly, I guess I would say it seems like there's the specter of political economy is haunting the conversation. So Kasha brought it up. I mean, the term buyer, right? And so the actual argument that Kari Green-Norgard makes underlying the whole thing is about the notion that economic and social security in Norway is underwritten by the oil state. And so it seems like one version of your argument has to do with to what extent economic security is or isn't provided by us. We don't really get into that. And of course it's attractive to get your home bought out. And an argument is that many people who don't, quote unquote, believe in climate change may find that climate change or dealing with climate change threatens their own economic security. Obviously work on energy, kinds of community ownership of something like wind makes a huge difference. So, I mean, how do you, where are these political economic categories? How do you, negotiate their relationship to the kind of more cultural analysis that you're doing? Is this something we'll see more of in the book?
Yes. It is. And Daniel and Kasha and Raka have all read and provided incredibly helpful comments on the draft of this paper I presented here that I am incorporating. And so, yeah, I think that's a really, really key question. The level of economic security in terms of that portion of the question provided by the buyouts, really changed over time. So initially more than later, and as it turned out, something like, I think 20% roughly of the houses in these areas turned out to have underwater mortgages and couldn't take part even with pre-storm value without some kind of level of debt forgiveness. So a lot of, these things kind of came into play through the process. But then also, that piece of Kari Norgard's argument is really important for thinking about the similarities and the denial and the kind of implication people felt in problems of climate change and the way that conflicted with the sort of patriotic discourses that run all the way through this as well.
Well, please join me in thanking Liz and Nick